So we're going to begin the fourth session. I can walk anywhere. We're going to begin the fourth session called Dialogues. It's a round table and open discussion. It's with Bertie Ferdman, Norman Frisch, and Tom Seller. They're going to be talking about the curatorial conversation, articulating modes of practice, which relates to the Yale Journal Theater Summer 2014 issue, curating the performance. So thank you so much, and come right up. And I'll...
Can we ask everybody to come down if you're staying? Come on down.
It's a round table.
So we can see you. A round table without the table. Okay, well, thank you for staying at the end of a long day. I'm Tom Seller. I'm the editor of the journal Theater, which is published by Yale University, Yale School of Drama in the U.S. And this is an informal event, I hope, to talk about our Summer 2014 edition, which is about performance curators. The title has changed a number of times. We're currently calling it Performance Curators, which is going to be released at the end of May. There is a flyer about that publication in your registration packet if you are interested in reading it by the end of this hour, and I hope that you will be. Thank you to Dina and to Jane for inviting us to share this project with you today. We're really excited to be here and to be part of such a stimulating event. With me on stage are two people who are an important part of that project. Bertie Ferdman, the guest co-editor for that edition of Theater, and Norman Frisch, one of the contributors and interviewees in the edition, which consists of interviews with, I think it's 8 professionals working in a curatorial practice of different kinds, as well as a photo dossier project. Judy Hussey Taylor, who spoke this morning and is sitting in the front row, is also one of the contributors. So I'm pleased that we have actually almost a critical mass from the masthead here in this room today. So what we're going to do is each of us is going to talk about either about the project or some of the questions that we hope that it explores. There are images. Yes, there are images from the edition, which are mostly images of performance projects that are discussed in the volume. And then if there's time, we would love to open the conversation up and make this truly a roundtable, so let's see how that plays out. So I'm the first speaker, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about our idea for the issue and what's in it. Bertie and I came together to do this publication project out of a kind of reader's frustration. There's loads of literature about curation in general, visual arts curation. But surprisingly, there's very little written about performance curators, at least in English. And that's surprising given how significant their role is in determining which performances are seen, how they are presented, and to what public. Theater is a journal that has always been devoted to creative intersections around theater and performance, and the work in our pages has, in recent years, reflected the growing influence of performance curators. We've featured a lot of site-specific urbanist performances, dance with conceptual dimensions, utopian theater projects, art performance hybrids, civic activism and social practice, and festivals organized around various kinds of curatorial platforms. For example, the Steirischer Herbst Festival in Austria in 2012. So it was clear to us that curation in its new forms could reinvigorate theater discourse, if not the theater itself, and could help us to find new modes of presentation, but that we need to talk about the practices that are around us. So out of a desire to read the conversations that we wanted to read, we decided to actually conduct those conversations. For me, there was also a personal interest in this professional development. I've been editing theater since 2003, very much in the kind of mode process of a curator, I think. I probably should think more like an editor, but I don't. I try very hard to offer critical frames around artists, around productions, around projects, in response to the kinds of tendencies that I see. Prompts, provocations, championing, advocacy, but in print, in publication. So I've been wondering, can I take this further? Perhaps taking a cue from the curators and the artists who I follow. Could a journal have an experiential component, for example? Journals exist to create community, to create dialogue. Could a journal be part of a larger platform, a public programs platform that would augment our published content? Could criticism, in the larger sense of the word, be a foundation, a process for programming strategies? So to that end, I've been working on developing a curatorial platform at Yale that will go with the journal. And next year, I'll be introducing a new course in the MFA Dramaturgy and Criticism program at the Drama School at Yale on curating performance, which will be for theater managers and also for our dramaturgs and critics in training. So I needed a text that I could teach with as well, and that was another one of my goals in creating this edition of the magazine, which I hope will be a teachable text for that purpose. So what's in the magazine? It consists primarily of interviews, as I've said, with a range of people who work in different aspects of performance curation. They come from a variety of backgrounds and practices. And it was very important to me that we keep these conversations in the voice of the people who we spoke with. We really wanted their vision, their voice, their personalities to come through in these interviews. So we've edited them as carefully as we can to convey that. The curatorial conversation, which you can experience in 8 different ways. And then the other aspect of the curatorial conversation that we wanted to make sure was included was the conversation about curation that has been going on in the visual arts context, but which we now need to apply to the realm of performance. That's what Bertie did in her introductory essay, which looks at literature. So those conversations include interviews with Norm Frisch from dramaturgy background, who's worked with an amazing constellation of artists, including the Worcester Group, Peter Sellers, and many, many others, who's worked in a festival and a museum and theater contexts, including recently at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Also, there are interviews with 2 curators who, after working for much larger organizations, founded their own research-intensive performance platforms. Joanna Warsza, who is Polish, works in Germany and across Europe, who is the curator of this year's controversial Manifesta in St. Petersburg, who also founded a now defunct but very interesting platform called the Laura Palmer Foundation in homage to David Lynch, which sponsored urban interventionist performances in various contexts. Another curator, Gavin Krober, a young curator, formerly worked for Creative Time in New York, founded a platform called Experience Economies, and later another platform called the Studio for Social Production, both in New York or Boston, but with international projects and dealing with the neoliberal experience economy and thinking about performances that might speak to it. There are also interviews with 2 artists who curate projects sometimes. Lola Arias from Argentina, who is a documentary theater maker primarily, but who also has curated a range of performances. She was the co-curator and co-founder with Stefan Kegi from Germany's Rimini Protocol of a platform called Parallel Cities, Ciudades Paralelas, which was a series of site-specific investigations of urban geographies all around the globe. Another artist who also curates is the American choreographer Ralph Lemon, who has curated programs for MoMA in New York, for Dance Space, and elsewhere. And that interview is Ralph in conversation and dialogue with another important curator in dance in the dance world, Judy Hussey-Taylor, here today. As if by telepathic command, there he is with his dance piece. That's the Yale Repertory Theater, actually. There are also two maverick visionaries from Europe, Helen Cole in the UK, who founded the In Between Time Festival, talking about her work there, and Matthias Lilienthal, who we just spoke about in the previous panel session, who works in Berlin and in Beirut, who is the curator of the 2014 festival Theater der Welt, who was formerly the head of HOW in Berlin and the dramaturg at the Berliner Volksbühne when it was the hotbed of experimentation and resistance to globalized capitalism, who recently has also been running the Ashkal Alwan Home Workspace, a studio, school, and curatorial platform in Beirut. Those interviews are supplemented by a dossier by the curator Hannah Herzig, who is the founder of an international project called the Mobile Academy, an interactive public events platform which explores performative aspects of the so-called knowledge sector, puts experts in sort of theatrical interactions with different kinds of publics and raises questions about social transmission and the transmission of information in the information age, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, they're coming to Toronto in May. So look out for the Mobile Academy, coming soon to an industrial warehouse near you. So there are many questions raised by these interviews, and as the editor, I can't resist quoting just from a couple of them very quickly. Matthias, I have 4 quotes just to throw out, not knowing where they will go, but maybe we'll come back to them in the round table. Yes, sorry. So my first quote is from Matthias Lilienthal in my interview with him. Matthias was deeply critical as a lifelong theater maker of white cube approaches to performance, some of which we've touched on today, and has a certain anxiety about how the visual arts world is moving into theater and how it displaces resources from theater makers. And he told me, quote, "I think the visual arts world at this moment is a kind of monster that is eating everything, and I think the next thing that it will eat is theater." My second quote is from Gavin Krober, who's coming from the opposite direction, from the visual arts sector, who also is starting to work in performance and theater contexts. And he says, in a critical way of the theater world, quote, "Why, if experimental theater has embraced performance, do theater makers keep making shows? Why is Radio Hole's next show going to be a show and not a restaurant? What if we affirm the theatricality of all these other forms? What would that mean as a form of institutional activism? To ask, how would you present a restaurant created by artists who are using techniques of theater?" Third quote, Norm, maybe setting you up for later, who told me, "The big crisis in the presentation of new or experimental work in the US context for many decades now has been the question of context. I think the creation of a contextual structure in which an audience and artist can understand one another is always a struggle." And finally, my own question, which comes from my introductory article, quoting myself, but I'll do it anyway. Could the curation of theater, dance, and performance become a catalyst for the rejuvenation and development of those forms in the 21st century? Can curation facilitate and assimilate hybridity in those forms? Is curation the ultimate challenge for the performing arts? maybe return to those when we've heard from the others. Thank you.
Thanks. Now I'm thinking about so many things too. So, thanks, Tom. I'm going to talk about also just briefly before I talk a little bit about my article is just how I came to the project and who I am. I'm primarily my first Spanish is my first language is Spanish. So when I'm in public, I have to pronounce. Okay, so I'm primarily a scholar and researcher, and I research contemporary performance, and I mostly am interested in performance that pushes at the boundaries of what performance is, coming from more a theater background. And therefore, I write about site-based work. I'm currently working on a monograph that's called Off-Site Contemporary Performance Beyond Site-Specific. I've already written a little bit about approaches that go beyond what I think is a very generic term, site-specific, so that encompasses a lot of practices that include immersive different modes of spectatorship, interactivity, both virtual and in real life. And I'm also very, very interested in pushing on the boundaries of theater, but also on space. So I also am interested in theater that happens in non-brick spaces outside of traditional spaces, virtual, real life, and in the urban space. So because I write about contemporary urban dramaturgies or dramaturgies that are, encompass site-based practices, I started to understand that these artists have to engage with not just the content of the work, but its form, which then led me to think about, okay, but how are they going to be presented? So if these artists are experimenting with form, where are they, who's booking them? Like, who's commissioning them? And then somebody said this before, like if artists are experimenting, then the people who are presenting them need to create new models to present them because it's not working anymore. So that's kind of how I started thinking about this. I also sometimes have to write about a piece of theater, and I think Beatrice spoke about this in the morning, about the creation of meaning. So here I am as a writer, scholar, researcher, trying to write about the meaning of a work, but I also think about context. So I think, okay, it's part of a festival, so what was the programmer thinking? And I often go to the little booklet, and there's nothing there. And I get a little frustrated as the PhD, background, thinking, okay, why are these discourses not merging? Why are artistic directors not contextualizing a little more, et cetera. So these are just conversations that were happening in my mind when I think we came with the idea of slow down. Good. Okay. So I'll slow down. So these were some of the questions that I started with, and that I think are that we address in the issue. How do these get programmed? Do they and when I say they, I mean the artists, the actual productions, in whatever shape, form they might be. Do they comply with traditional box office standards? How are audiences conceived? What is the nature of the event? What is the experience desired? Would they remain conventional in terms of operating within traditional economic producer performing arts models? So again, I came to this piece of work thinking if artists are, and this is what I said before, if artists are experimenting and questioning norms of their art, then how are the people who program them questioning their own practices? Okay, so as Tom mentioned, we embarked on a project that we wanted to read ourselves. I started to think, okay, what am I going to write? I had to read something, and then I started reading all the visual art books that you saw over there on curating. There was nothing kind of from the performing arts theater world, except one issue that's called Frančka. I think I'm mentioning it wrong, number 55. Yes, it's Croatian, but there's an English translation. And at the time, and I'll come back to this in a little bit because I mentioned in the article, there was a show after we started on the project called The Curator's Piece. And I'll come back to that because I think it's important to the conversation. So because Tom mentioned the general overview of the issue, I'm just going to talk very briefly and touch on the article, which hopefully you can all read and buy. So it's called From Content to Context, which is the last quote that actually he talked about context before when he quoted Norm. From Content to Context, the changing landscape of the performance curator. And I do three things. I talk about where the origins, like what's the historical context for this, okay? I also discuss a range of alternative presenting models that bridge the gap between visual and performing arts. And then I finally end by saying, okay, well, where is all this going? Where does this leave the role of the performance curator? And I dare to say that now we're going from a logistics of programming to a concept for programming. That's in the theater, okay? Because just a little parenthesis here, I think it's really interesting because this is a, because this is a round table. Before there was the presenter from Japan. Is he? I forgot your name. What? Yes, who was mentioning this role, this very interesting thing between the dramaturg and the curator that we have to start thinking about, because which leads to the historical context of the curator as taking care of objects, right? So as in the 60s and even earlier, and Beatrice talked about this earlier today, I'm going to slow down. Once art moved out of objecthood, exhibition people had to start thinking of new ways. In other words, temporality became an issue in museums. They had to deal with new ways of exhibition design. So it's the same, there's a parallel going on with the dramaturg. There's a text, very dramatic, right? I mean, drama word. And once that moves out of text, we're moving on to a different sphere. So again, as presenters, I'm not one of them, but we have to find new models for that. So it's really kind of a coming together, dramaturg, curator meeting kind of at the middle. So visual art, performing art. And so before I just quickly talk about the alternative curating models, I come back to the curator's piece, okay, which came to, and there's one photo that shows it. But this piece basically unveiled the conditions in which art is created, in which performing arts is created, which has actually been happening in the visual arts for decades now. That's just institutional critique. It's just now new in theater for some reason. But they really, I mean, this is, okay, I'm going to slow down. Okay, so, so moving on, just leaving that, and I want to describe, for those of you who didn't see it, that piece. How many people know of that piece or saw it? Or, okay, so enough that it's worthwhile to just quote for just a second. Quoting myself. So just to give you an example, they had 8 curators on the stand. So you would, listening to them, tell you about their own curation. And the night I saw it, Vallejo Gantner, Coil's curator, was on the hot seat. It was like the curator is on trial. That was the setup of the piece. And the other curators relentlessly questioned him about his programming choices, his use of time, his paycheck, his fundraising strategy, his countless international travels, and his artistic vision. What is your personal proposal to the audience? What influences your programming? What makes it distinct? What's new in Coil? Are you jealous of American realness? The questions that they were asking. So I think what they wanted to do is open up a conversation about curating. We can argue about whether you liked or not the show, but that was the point of that show. And so basically in my article, I tried to actually give examples of alternative curating practices as opposed to theorize about it. So I talk about David Levine and a portfolio that he actually wrote with his collective called Cine, for Theater Magazine. That's really a form of institutional critique. It's a manifesto for the public theater, which is not really public, but it is. It's a whole controversial issue about why it's still called the public. And so in that piece, which you can read, it's just a manifesto, okay, David Levine and his collective really talk about not just dramatizing dissent, but radically restructuring the presentational format of the way that art gets presented, if that makes sense. So, for example, he talks about not just hiring superstars, but creating a set of artists that will then be marketed. I think one of the photos that, oh, it stopped, is of like creating artists as opposed to using stars. Or he talks about making the corporate partnership that is obvious in New York completely transparent. So calling one of the pieces Commission X, and X stands for if Bank of America is financing your show, then you call it Bank of America show, or things like this. The other piece that I talk about is called True Riches, which is how artists are actually using a curatorial strategy as a form of resistance or reacting against something. True Riches is a program, it's an imaginary program. Am I going slow enough? I'm almost done. Okay, good. Is an imaginary program created by artists Ann Hampton and Tim Etchell. And you can go online and see this. Again, this is just imaginary, and you can read about it. So when the Institute of Contemporary Arts closed, because there was no more money, well, because because I forget his name, but the main curator said that there was no more money for live art. It wasn't as, they weren't going to fund live art anymore. Basically, True Riches or Ann Hampton and Tim Etchell got together to put a program, imaginary program, that would fill the ICA gallery for hours and days and months and months and months. And some of the, in the article I highlight what some of the pieces that they curated in that imaginary program. National Theatre of Wales is another example that's quite interesting. I don't know if some of you are familiar. They had, a few years ago, they got it's the second National Theatre of Wales, but it's the first English speaking. So they got £3 million to start a theatre company over 3 years. And instead of building a building, they just decided that we're a national theater. And when I say they, I think it was a collective of people. So they just created an office in Cardiff, and they built a show every month for 12 months in a different place of Wales with the people of each community and with a different strategy, a different technique, etc. Foundry Theater is another example based in New York. Artistic director Melanie Joseph, who does not have a theater to take care of, but every project is its own. It's an event. Everything is questioned. Everything is decided. Everything is a conscious choice, from the box office to the people to the audience, etc. And finally, two others. One of them who is here but I haven't met, Forrest Fringe, Deborah Pearson. I don't know if she's in the audience. Oh, there you are. So nice to meet you. Okay, so you were highlighted in this. That's great. And well, there I was in Brooklyn reading about you. So because like Ciudades Paralelas, which Tom mentioned, I feel like there's this new trend in, and that's why I say from context to concept. Now we're touring concepts. They created micro-festivals that has toured. So this is also, you were talking about this in Awilda in the panel, like to sustain yourself, artists are now creating concepts that they tour. So it's also related to the labor and the economy of it, because you're no longer paying for props or sets to travel. You're paying local labor if you need it, but you're traveling concepts. I think that's like a new thing. And I think I'll stop there, but I do want to end with a question. Oh, one more thing is from two of the people that I interviewed, Helen Cole and Lola Arias, two things that stood out that I think are interesting given the amount of women in the audience in this conference is that they both talked about the taking care, taking care in terms of performance. Lola, I just put this out there because I thought it was interesting, talks about her work really as a mother figure, even though she's not a mother, and how she's always taking care of everybody, like people. And then how in Buenos Aires, psychoanalysts, everybody's doing psychoanalysis, so she's also a psychoanalyst. That's part of her curating. You listen to it, you analyze it, you pry it open, offering new possibilities for what is already there, enlivening its potential. And then Helen Cole talks about taking care of performances remains, what remains, which is why she came to her fireworks projects, where she recorded people's memories of shows that maybe they've seen years ago, and then you walk through a space and you listen to audiences' memories. So I think that's a wonderful context for audience. And then finally, what I got from just all these curators and how they work is that I think the role of the curator emerges as really a contradictory one who questions preconceived assumptions that shape performance, as well as his or her own role in shaping that discourse. I think that's really important. And Helen Cole has a quote, and it says, "One who works with new forms, but within established centers." So I think it's really a contradictory role. And a final question, and it goes with what I think has been going on here, and especially because you're starting this program and ICCP is starting. For me, I'm interested as an educator and innovative art. So what is the role of education and creating actual professional training programs? How can that change and invigorate, as you were saying, the field? Because really we're responsible in bridging the gap between people in the professional field saying, "Oh, I'm not into discourse." Like, if you train curators, then they'll be hired because you're professionalizing that role. So, it's a question: how do you do that?
Okay, I'll speak very briefly, and then we'll open up the conversation. I am one of those people who Masahiko spoke of earlier and has been referenced several times today, a dramaturg who works as a curator. My background is as a theater dramaturg, and but I've been working since I was in my late 20s also as a curator. This came about initially as a kind of accident. One of my primary theater partners is the director Peter Sellers, the American theater and opera director Peter Sellers. Peter and I were both in Los Angeles during the Olympic Arts Festival in 1984. And then the Olympic Arts Festival was such a success in the city that some of the extra money that was left from the Olympics was put into a fund to create an ongoing arts festival in the city. And it occurred again in 1987. Both 1984 Olympic Arts Festival and the Los Angeles Festival in 1987 were curated by a man named Robert Fitzpatrick. It was a very conventional, big city, big venue, big production arts festival, very much modeled on Edinburgh and that type of festival. And in 1987, Fitzpatrick announced that he was stepping down. He was going to take charge of Euro Disney outside of Paris. Disney was one of the big sponsors of these festivals, and they were looking for a new director for this festival in Los Angeles. And Peter and I were in Los Angeles. Peter was recruited as a candidate and then eventually appointed as the new director of the Los Angeles Festival. It was a little outrageous, given that he had never lived in Los Angeles and only visited a few times, but there you go. He was young and hot, and he got the job. And so Peter and I moved to Los Angeles to begin programming a Los Angeles Festival in the year 1990. This was every 3 years, this festival. And it was wonderful because when I walked in today and Dina and I met for the first time, she reminded me that she had attended this 1990 Los Angeles Festival that I curated with Peter and about a dozen other people. And we learned, we taught ourselves, and we're of this generation of people now who are over 50, who are largely self-taught curators of festivals, of performance spaces, and so on. So it's very interesting to me now to attend this moment when we're moving from the generation of self-taught curators to curators who are being taught in formalized university-affiliated programs. On the one hand, I think the people who taught themselves and who didn't set out to be curators when they were young but were something else first and began curators, became curators, bring a great deal from their previous experience to their work as curators. And most of them probably began as artists of one sort or another. I'm a little skeptical of the notion that someone at a very young age should decide, oh, curation is what I want to do. And yet, there is no need for every generation to reinvent this wheel. You know, a great deal has been learned in the last 50 years especially, and certainly Peter and I were the beneficiaries of a great deal of experience by people who were a few steps ahead of us and who took us under their wing when we were young and showed us some different ways of thinking about things and that things had been done before. One of those important people who Dina and I were talking about earlier was Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimlid. Most of you who are in one of these curation studies programs will know her. She is a folklorist, but she has specialized in the field of museum studies, festival, and public presentations of traditional culture. And she's a very distinguished scholar who teaches at NYU in the Performance Studies program. But she was a very great influence on us, and I like to think that the work we did then and the work that Peter and I have done both together and separately as curators since still is very informed by a lot of the information that she shared with us. We were also deeply impressed as we looked around at other festivals that would present alternative models to the predominant European or East Coast festival model, that Edinburgh model, which we knew just wasn't right for Los Angeles, although it had been quite successful. We began to look around at festivals that we thought were very successful. One of them we looked at was the Festival of Pacific Cultures, which still goes on every 3 years, I believe, around various countries in the Pacific Rim, the South Pacific in particular, and also the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, which was creating a free festival on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and the idea of a free festival that tried to interpret American culture to itself was something we thought was very important and was actually what a festival in Los Angeles probably should be. But rather than being concentrated in a single space in the center of a single city, Los Angeles, as you know, is a huge city and an even larger county of Los Angeles. And so we were talking about an urban festival over a vast geographic space and how to think about that. And it immediately became clear to us that the notion of a theater festival as it traditionally existed was reflecting a very narrow idea of theater itself internationally, and that was already at a kind of dead end. So the idea of a new kind of curation was maybe a way of saving theater, which was in the process of, it had become so introverted that it was looking only at itself. And so we were seeing two simultaneous trends. One was that commercial theater was becoming only for the rich, and that has only become more true in the last 25 years. To take a family to a Broadway show now can cost upwards of $300. You know, the cheap tickets now are in the $60 or $70. And the expensive tickets are upwards of $200. And so that theater audience was shrinking. The other theater audience at the other end of the spectrum in alternative theaters and performance spaces was people who were performing for their friends and for a very small spectrum of art world enthusiasts. And almost everyone in between was losing any direct experience of the theater world. So our notion was to try to propel the theater world out of theaters and back into other public space. And that project led to a number of other festivals, and most recently I've been curating in a museum space. One of the reasons that interested me particularly is because at the Getty Museum, they created the role of a performance curator in the Antiquities Division. The Antiquities Division at the Getty Museum, which is housed at the Getty Villa, the original Getty Museum, is primarily Greek and Roman material. And so it was a challenge to present theater in the context of Greek and Roman culture at a time when theater sat very, very close to the center of culture and the center of power, of political power. And I thought that was an important thing for us to look at the moment, for Americans especially to look at the moment. If America has been the new Rome, and America is about to be, you know, the new end of Rome, then in fact the role of theater in this process was an important one to look at, and that those were still very valid models. And at the same time I've been continuing to work as a theater dramaturg and teaching theater dramaturgy. Okay, let's open it up to you. Is there something you'd like to talk about? Oh, I'm sorry. We're hogging both microphones. So let me ask for those of you who are students, so to speak, in the largest sense, of performance curation, where do you look for history? Where do you look for role models? And where have you been looking in terms of literature? We started with the challenge, that Tom mentioned of simply not having what might be a contemporary text.
Dina DeVita, so I am a student and perpetually always will be one. I'm being honored as a student this year, as a matter of fact. And I'm also a teacher. And so I want to just, this really moved me to stand up and say something. So I've been a practitioner, a dancer, and I'm a self-taught curator now. I was an artistic director. I've mutated into my new title recently. And I've also always been an academic all my life. Before I did my bachelor's in the 70s, and I did a doctorate in the last few years. So I've never felt a divide myself as an individual between what all of academic life has offered me and all of professional life. I'm continuously astonished that that divide persists. And the other divide that stuns me as I listen to us talk and you talk and me think, and then I'll come to your question about finding literature, is this divide between the visual arts culture and the performative, performing, P-E-R-F-O-R-M cultures. And I'm actually envisioning with this conference that at some point, if we develop this conversation, this discourse, that the two worlds can collide and have a dialogue again and not just kind of interfere with each other. But they are very different cultures, and part of it, my agenda is I feel that, I'll just say it out loud and then I can get massacred by my peers. I feel the performing arts have been kidnapped by arts management somehow, whereas in the visual arts, they've been kidnapped by arts historians. And this is why our cultures have grown that's sort of my latest analysis. There will be others. So I think we have a problem to solve, and you put your finger on it. No one can afford it anymore because it's about really generating money in the box office. Okay. Oh, you want to? Okay. Then I'll talk about the literature thing.
Oh, let me just respond briefly, and then we'll continue.
Yes.
I have the same feeling for many years. I had a tremendous opportunity back in the early part of the century. There was a gallery in New York called Exit Art, one of the original kind of Soho alternative artist spaces that had always made a space for installation and performance work, but was primarily known for the visual artists that it had incubated and supported over a period of decades. They were getting ready to leave their Soho space, and they were interested in embracing theater artists, and especially artists from that downtown Soho theater movement, which had been so influential and important before they left the neighborhood. And they asked me to curate a show, which happened in 2001, the spring of 2001, which we called Show People. And it was an attempt to present 6 theater artists as visual artists. And they were all artists who had their kind of working roots in downtown New York theater. Richard Foreman, Robert Wilson, Anne Bogart, Meredith Monk, and posthumously Reza Abdo. He had died just about a year before, maybe 2 years before. And these were all people who consider themselves visual artists, but who had been sort of excluded, maybe with the exception of Bob Wilson, excluded from the ranks of visual artists because they worked in the theater. And so we gave them each an opportunity to create a room in this exhibition, and the room was meant to exemplify kind of the the meeting place of their visual art and their performing arts practice. The show was a tremendous success, and for each of them, with the exception of Bob Wilson, it was the first time that any gallery or museum had ever asked them to show work. Since then, a lot of them have shown in museums. Some of them shortly after had work at the Walker Art Center, and just now the Queen's Museum has done an enormous installation by Peter Schumann, the director of Bread and Puppet Theater. But at 20 years ago, or what was that now, 13, 14 years ago, that wasn't the case. So there does seem to be forward movement in that direction. But on the other hand, I see not so many younger theater artists now. Maybe they're not theater artists, maybe they're in other realms where I don't see them, who strike that balance of performing and visual artists simultaneously.
There is that, but then there's the idea of the whole two cultures of those worlds interpenetrating and colliding in various ways. And I'm just wondering if that divide is going to persist or if that can shift. And this kind of conversation for me can bring us into conversation with the visual arts world, because we're not talking about this together enough. I sit in a room with other arts, we call them presenters here, or diffuseurs in French, and we don't talk about art. 90 of us sit together in the dance world in Canada. We talk about the business of presenting. And this is one of the reasons why I had to do this conference. But I'll just come back to literature. I mean, this involves Jane, because we spent a year combing every book we could find for any glimmer of any article, and fell on Beatrice's Cultures of the Curatorial with 2 chapters on dance curating. You couldn't believe it. The Francisca Journal. The Conversation in Essen we found, and there was notes from it that I hold in my hands preciously. And then there's the journal that we found out about it when you told us about it. And then I think there's going to be this book that we're going to publish, but I think there needs to be a conversation, a literature, and more meetings like this somewhere else. Somebody else can organize it. But we keep our website as a kind of a resource. But where could this lead us, I guess, is a great question for the end of the day for everybody. Where could this meeting of minds lead us? Can we form a community, a literature, a dialogue? Can this be part of this movement that those other journals and meetings have started to create? Can it be more than just we're here for 3 days? That's really what I guess Jane and I are hoping for a lot. I mean, this is for everybody. Maybe a question for the end of this day.
Well, I was speaking with someone earlier. Who was it, about Pacific Standard Time? Someone who's not here anymore. Oh. There has been a big project in Los Angeles over the last, 5 years or so, called Pacific Standard Time, which is an attempt for cultural institutions in Los Angeles to look at their own histories, and in particular this period in the 1960s and 70s when Los Angeles was a kind of cultural hotbed of new ideas. One of the things it did was it very successfully brought together performing arts and visual arts institutions under a kind of civic umbrella to look at the same period of time in all of their different art forms. And I think from a civic, organizational, institutional point of view, it was tremendously successful. And the city and the Getty Foundation, which is funding it, has committed itself now to some sort of ongoing activity under this umbrella. And I'm wondering if maybe there's a partner organization there.
It's the bigger question. And it's why we're trying so hard to bring people from all around the world and struggle to have Masahiko from Japan and to have someone studying Egypt and so on. a big international community just beginning to dialogue together, create literature together. Where could this lead us? What do you think? Do you have the microphone?
I just had a thought again. I just always, as an educator, I just think it's, I have two thoughts about that. One has to do with the panel before, situation. I think it's great to have an international community, but boy, does it work differently in Japan than Puerto Rico than France. I mean, the whole infrastructure of theater and the arts in France is just incomparable. So yes, I think it's great to have an international conversation, but I think that learning and educating I mean, this is a bigger conversation. Again, I think as an educator, what I think is not being taught in art programs, whether it be theater, dance, or visual arts a little more, but it's the whole economy of the contextualization of the economy in the work. In other words, again, it goes back to institutional critique. I mean, I'm going from bigger to like blah, 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 blah. But these are just big thoughts and ideas that you asked. So two things is situational context and education. I think that, I mean, I live in different worlds. I go to the academic theater conferences where they're educating undergraduate theater students, and boy, are they totally disconnected from the professional theater world in a big way. And then I went once to APAP and I got the hell out of there. APAP is the presenters conference or something, the shopping mall for presenting art. And I mean, I think there needs to be bridges there. How can people presenting performance not be educated in the forms that they're presenting? I don't understand that.
I do live in the UK, and our organization is in the UK. I wanted to make the point that I think that part of this might be about documentation, especially with younger performance curators. I know that I've just started lecturing last year, and I decided I wanted to teach my students about Forest Fringe, and I found that our documentation on Forest Fringe is actually very incomplete and not as good as I would like it to be. And I think that this also might be one of the reasons that you're struggling to think of younger artists working between theater and visual arts, because I could tell you, 15 right now, but do they have proper documentation on their websites? I mean, do they have proper documentation anywhere? Whereas a company like Forest Entertainment or Robert Wilson or any of these older companies have been invested in documentation since the beginning. And I think that's also a big question for education too. How can you teach about an ephemeral practice that isn't documenting itself?
Hello, I'm Freya Olofsson. Working in the middle of Canada between the intersections of live performance, background in dance, and visual arts. One of the things that stuck out to me was the first quote that you had, where it was, let me get it right now, the visual artists infiltrating theater, which often I hear it the other way around. The thing of looking at broadening the conversation and also just looking at the fact that we both disciplines, visual arts as well as contemporary performance, have different histories that you're taught through school and that you think about and that you obsess about in the communities that you interact with, is that there is definitely a lack of dialogue between the makers, the presenters, the curators. And I think where it could lead us is that we start to not think about a theater artist infiltrating the Visual Arts Center and the visual arts centers, visual artists infiltrating the theater, that we just might have look at artists who necessitate a space with light control and higher ceilings and a black box versus a white box, given the parameters that the spaces provide. So I think it'll dissolve some boundaries hopefully.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So Oh yeah, so this is like concluding, and then I'll do the housekeeping notes. Perfect. No, I feel very proud of but I do. I feel very proud that. No, I'm happy. You know, I'm here, but I also work in the South Bronx in this organization, Pepetien, with Marianne Soto, Pepona Sorio, and all these things. But I was inspired by a few things, being able to attend the National Performance Network conferences, reading about Spark, which is a program here in Montreal that Miriam started at Studio 303. And there was a third thing, that we got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, New York City Cultural Innovation Fund, for a group of artists, experimental Latino artists working with African roots. And as a result of that, I did this APAP at home, which I have to change the title because I have a lawyer involved now. It was like, does APAP know that you're using their name? So I have to change it. But anyway, all it is was just I had to get this whole idea of APAP and how bizarre it is. And I did 5 years of showcases at City Center, which is really cold, not fun, very demoralizing. So, but it's also an opportunity to get, going back, this is like the marketplace stuff, but I tried to like blur the boundaries or soften them a little bit by, I had to get a transportation to pick people up at the Hilton Hotel to bring them up to the Bronx to see things. Once I got them up there, we got, time with them and a big lunch to serve with artists and presenters talking, and basically like something like this, but not as evolved as this, because we were not talking about curatorial issues as much, but I guess it was just to talk back about APAP and what a bizarre animal it is. It's also an opportunity because as this, like, you have people coming from all over, but how do you, American Realness is doing it, but how are other ways that we can activate those moments so that it doesn't get ripped away from us and it stays back on the art and the artists, and kind of cultivating some, stronger conversations or something that can go someplace else in the bigger picture. Okay, so moving on.
I just want to encourage everyone to read the journal once again, even though we are out of time, and I'd call your attention to the form that's in
So
your
when
packets.
exactly is it coming out?
The end of May.
Okay. We've been waiting to know. Yeah! Woo-hoo!
So thank you so much, and I am going to move into housekeeping. It's just moving on. One thing, first of all, like, you look fabulous. And if you're looking tired tomorrow, you just remember tired is sexy. So you don't say, oh my God, you look like a wreck. You say, you look sexy. Okay. So also, this is really housekeeping. We've thrown out 200 cups. So if you can get a magic marker and write your name on the cup, that would be good. Just so we don't, so you just keep it for the day rather than keep throwing them out.
Buy those eco cups. Buy them. They're beautiful.
She's not getting a commission. Tonight, I don't know if you're going to Studio 303 at 8:30, but it starts at 8:30, 303. It's on St. Catherine. Tomorrow, we're going to start here, yes, at 9 a.m. here for the 2 keynotes and a respondent. Then we'll be splitting up into 2 rooms. The other room is just right there. I think that's enough for now.
I just want to say again what Jane said. Feel free to move between the 2 rooms. Personally, I'm torn myself between the 2 rooms, so everyone will understand if you want to hear a bit of this and a bit of that. I'm going to try myself. That's it. So 303, I've been asked 5 times. It's 5 minutes walk from here, very close. Just down to St. Catherine Street and about a block over. There's 372. It's in your booklet, St. Catherine. It's very, very easy to find. So see you tomorrow. Bye. Absolutely return the headphones. Yes.